Hello and welcome to Beyond Markets, where we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. Welcome, I'm Kenneth Igbomor. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. On our show today, a former president of Ghana says Africa needs a clear strategy to support public interest media. We'll find out more on what he has to say. Now you can join the conversation on social media and let us know what you think. The hashtag to use is Beyond Markets. You can also send me a message on Twitter, and my handle, that's at Kenneth Igbomor, and use the hashtag Beyond Markets, as I said earlier. Now, as the COVID-19 outbreak continues to rise across Africa, a former president of Ghana, John Kufuor, says fulfilling Africa's future agenda will require a transformation on the value of our society's place on knowledge and expertise and in how we communicate and interact with one another. He also notes that Africa needs a clear, determined strategy to support public interest media. He joins me now from Accra for more insight on this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, sir. And I would like to start up first reading through your write-up you put up. You mentioned the fact that we need the triple jeopardy that Africa is facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like you to clear some air on that.
Well, Africa, like the rest of the world, in fact, it's a pandemic. It's right now under the onslaught of COVID-19. And in that regard, Africa is jeopardized. In fact, the whole world is saying it. The entire world is in jeopardy. And then this pandemic is also devastating our economies. That too you know. But to tackle the situation in any way at all, we need communication. How do we communicate without sound and authentic information? Even the developed world is in a sort of quandary. So you can imagine much of our continent with all the many drawbacks that our information situation might not be the best to talk about under the circumstances. So these three things together constitute what I meant by triple jeopardy.
All right, but looking at how this COVID-19 pandemic is playing out across the continent, and Africa's development trajectory over the years has been, we've been talking about Africa rising for quite a while now. Would you say Africa needs to transform the value we place on knowledge, expertise, and how we communicate? I'd like you to speak on this development agenda for Africa with key organizations like the African Union and everybody putting things in place, and what you mean and how you think we need to further deepen this communication.
There's no doubt at all that education should be given the topmost priority for transformation, education. And when I talk education, it's not only the formal school-going, college-going education. Information is critical through the media. And the continent is so big, of at least 54 countries. The African Union has set the pace all right with the setting up of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which should enable us leapfrog, to use the words of the African Union itself. So African Union is doing what it can. But then, given the huge continent with its various degrees of development, because the background is not quite uniform, we would need intensified, purposeful educational system, short-term, medium to long-term. And especially for the short to medium, I believe the media should be empowered and should be given a public interest status so that it's not sort of manipulated and exploited in terms of vested interests, whether it's government, whether it's commerce, whether it's factional of any sort. We need objective, independent, and private media strong enough to disseminate information across the length and breadth of the continent so that when we talk Africa, the African citizen, whether he's in West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, or Northern Africa, would share in the appreciation and common vision of what we're trying to talk about. So adjusting our information systems is also very crucial for us. It's true that we get the knowledge.
All right, but looking at your report, the report you put out there, your op-ed you put out there, you also mentioned the fact that Africa needs a free press to hold governments accountable. Do you think that with the structures that it is right now, we're not holding governments accountable as much as we should?
I deliberately reminded you of the complexity and size of our continent. Some countries are operating what I would describe as free media systems for governance. And that would imply holding the governors to account and also to be transparent in policies, because these policies shape our lives. But I can say that for all the governments of our continent. But no doubt, since the beginning of this century and through the leadership of the African Union, you know, for instance, the African Union set up the to ensure that governments operated on more or less common principles and ethics. So the peoples of Africa would come by the good governance we all are entitled to. But I can't say that we are yet there.
Okay, so now let's look at the what fallout from this COVID-19 pandemic. This is just coming just a decade before the deadline set for the Sustainable Development Goals. And do you see this as an opportunity for Africa to fast-track development in some key areas?
Well, as we speak around the world, it does seem all developments are virtually being stalled because of the pandemic. What with the protocols of protection, social distancing, not going out of your home unless it's critically necessary, businesses folding up, even banks shutting down and that sort of thing. So talking development under the circumstances might not be quite the thing. The first thing is to be safe. When we look at the media, through you, we are learning that even in the so-called developed parts of the world, the death rate is really mind-boggling. Fortunately, Africa, as of now, is not suffering to the same extent as we read about, say, the United States of America, or what transpired in China, or in Europe, Italy, Spain, and now Britain. So Africa hasn't gotten to that degree. But since not even the best of science has been able to define what this onslaught is critically, we have to keep our fingers crossed and sort of try to dodge the onslaught. So such time that with the opening up, when science has helped us to find, say, a vaccine or whatever to contain the situation, what Africa perhaps should be doing at all levels, especially leadership level, is to plan and think ahead. When we get that green light, how do we move? What the pandemic is doing really is helping the world to accept that the most critical factor for living should be the respect for humanity. Humanity across the board, whether you are red, green, white, black, doesn't matter, because this pandemic is not exempting anybody. Not even the developed world. Everybody is in need. We are in the same boat. We sail together. We may sink together. So when the time comes, I would hope that politics around the world, and especially on our continent, would feel the responsibility to assist with such governance as would benefit inclusively all humanity, to give some dignity to man. And you know that our continent, in this regard, hasn't been justly treated down the centuries. But we come to the times when I believe human dignity, human development should be centered as the rationale for governance and for everything else. So this, I believe, would help quicken the consciences of governments and the corporate world that is also trying to exploit our continent everywhere. Everything must be justified only in terms of what it does for humanity.
All right, but looking at the new normal that we're in right now and the realities for Africa as it is, We're talking about social distancing now, a time of lockdowns, but then looking at the reality in Africa, how can we achieve this much needed behavioral change in Africa, like you rightly mentioned in your article, and how can we get Africans to to adhere to this? Because at the end of the day, people's lives depend on this.
Without the sound and objective and sincere operations of the media, and thankfully with the new technologies that are everywhere, even into our bedrooms and so invasive, without this, I do not see how we can do it. So whatever information we get through the operations of this public interest media, I believe is the chief channel. The channel that even enables governments to inform and educate our communities. And we tend to live communally on our continent, our cultures, with people-to-people contact. But this might be the perilous way for us to live now, because without social distancing, we may spread this pandemic that kills freely. So it's through the media, above all, that we must educate our people to protect ourselves against the pandemic. And social distancing, the protocols as they've been called, are the things that need to be disseminated through the media and, of course, through government policies and just responsible citizenship all over the place for us to protect us. Because without life, what is there? We must live. And to live means keeping the pandemic at bay. And how do we do it? With the lockdowns and knockdowns? No, it's only through the media, through the radio, television, social media for that matter. But we also know that the social media tend to be prone with misinformation and disinformation too. And because of that, the WHO has coined a term, infodemic, which is also perhaps one more jeopardy we are facing. And we hope public interest media would come in with that responsible communication that we do.
All right. So let's hold that thought for a bit. We need to take a quick break now. And then when we return, definitely we'll continue our conversation and we'll find out more on what you have to say about this public interest media that you're clamoring for. I've been speaking to the former president of Ghana, John Kufuor. We'll take a quick break on Beyond Markets right now, and just stick around. Welcome back to Beyond Markets. If you're just joining us, former president of Ghana, John Kufuor, is our guest today, and very interesting conversation we've been having. But sir, I'd like to start off by getting your thoughts on, how you see the state of press freedom in Africa from where it was and where you see things going in the near future.
Well, since the beginning of this century, I believe there's been marked improvement on press freedom on the continent, but it's nowhere near the ideal. Till the end of the last century, you remember the continent was everywhere marked by so-called strongmen, meaning dictatorial, authoritarian regimes, which didn't tolerate much of free speech, free thought, even free associations. But since the beginning of this century, and with the advent of the African Union, Africa, at least through the Union membership, has taken a position to use our constitutions to uphold human rights and to allow freedom of association, of speech, and of expression, which normally or mainly would express themselves and through the media. So, for instance, with my getting the chance to become the president of Ghana in 2001, the first law my government repealed was what was called the criminal libel law that had been in existence since the colonial times to muzzle the media through the sedition and libel laws. My government repealed that law, and within a few months, the whole place became awash with FM stations, television stations. And as I speak now, Ghana has more than 200 FM radio stations, television stations, plenty all over the place. And people are expressing themselves. But Ghana is not alone in this progress or advance. I'm sure go to places like South Africa, like East Africa, elsewhere. So Africa is really coming up fine. But saying this does not mean Africa has attained the degree of freedom of the media to the levels that might be requisite. We still have got some way to go till we uphold the dignity of human individual within responsible, I would say, circumstances for governance and also for the progress of our continent. We've got some way to go, but Africa is progressing.
All right, then, but I understand that you say that Africa also still needs a clear, determined strategy to support public interest media. And I understand that there are a couple of initiatives that you're working on, and I would like to get into that. Let's start with the first one, the International Fund for Public Interest Media. What is this fund about, and how is it going to play out?
Well, with the advent of the social media platforms, the online communication systems, the traditional media mechanisms are virtually collapsing. One, through loss of advertising revenues, and also reduced patronage of, say, the print media. You can sit with your mobile and see whatever is transpiring around you in the world. You don't need to go and pay for some paper outside. You don't need to put your advert on paper. So how do these papers run? And if the papers are not running, it means the reporters, the journalists, they are losing employment. To the extent that I believe the Reuters Institute for the Journalism Training has stated that, and especially with the onslaught of the pandemic, COVID-19, the media world globally might lose as much as $20 billion United States dollars with this time. If the developed world is losing revenue because of the online and all these new technologies, digital technologies around us, you can imagine what happens to the low-income parts of the world, like most of our countries of Africa. And because of this, to the very critical aspect of governance.
All right, so let's get into the second initiative. I understand it's the new African Public Interest Media Initiative. You know, how is it going to be implemented, and what are the plans to sustain it?
Along the same lines as I've tried to describe for the International Fund for the Public Media, to help support the media world. The Africa Media Initiative, in a way, would be like the Africa chapter of the International Fund for Public Interest Media. It's the same purpose, same thinking. Once the international world, the International Fund gets going, the Africa Media Interest will be set up along the same lines, managed by public experts in the profession, understanding our continent. And incidentally, I believe so far, Africa has tended to be defined from outside for us. But I would even go further to say that it doesn't seem the African knows the true identity of the continent yet. When I say African, I'm not sort of demeaning the African, no. But I would challenge you. I understand you are from Nigeria. Would you say the average Nigerian you stop in the street would be able to share with you much knowledge on what transpires in, say, East Africa or Southern Africa, or even within our neighborhood of West Africa. But we all talk Africa, 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 and Africa tends to be defined in terms of the pigment of our skins. Black. No, it's not. That is not enough. You look at Europe these days, the Europeans have an idea other than they are being white. North America, they have an idea other than it's a value system. It's a collection of system values. Yes, black, all right, but Africa that has been held down over the centuries by others who tell our history, try to tell our history for us, try to impose their culture, their languages on us. It's time we get a system, and I say the media would be a very interesting and very central machinery for the African to discover the continent and its values as they are, so we are able to tell the rest of the world what Africa is. And so we need this authoritative institution that would garner resources to support a very professional media center that would in turn support broadcasters and the journalists all over, including state broadcasters, like, say, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, like the Ghana Broadcasting, like what obtains in Nigeria. Support them with resources so they can do their work professionally for the African to be able to tell the world what Africa is, not just the blackness of Africa. And I'm sure when we put our mind to it, like Global Fund is being managed credibly and with integrity, we can also do the same.
All right, then, very interesting point of views you put across today, sir, on this very interesting subject about how the COVID-19, how the media could play a role in helping to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the continent. Thank you so much for your time. I've been speaking to John Kufuor. He's the former president of Ghana. Now, that's all on Beyond Markets for today. And thank you so much for being a part of the show. From me and the team, have a wonderful day. And remember to watch all previous episodes of the show on our website. That's at cnbcafrica.com. You can also catch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily. Thanks for watching.